Hi, it's Dr. Isom again, and I'm here to talk about personality traits, personality types, and the Big Five model. In this series of lectures, I'm first going to talk about the differences between types and traits in measuring personality. I'll give a brief history of research that has studied personality types and traits. Next, I'll talk about the research methods that are currently being used to associate behavior and personality traits. And then finally, I'll talk in detail about the five-factor model of personality, also known as the Big Five, as well as the facet traits that comprise each of those five factors. First, let's talk about personality traits and types. And we'll start with types. Personality types can be thought of as something like buckets. They are categories that you can classify people into if their personality traits match the description of the personality traits in that category. So, for example, we can take the blue bucket here of extroverts. We can describe extroverts as being very social, fast talking, love to talk, love to be in large groups of people, would rather go to parties than stay home and watch a movie with a close friend. These are all traits that describe an extrovert, as opposed to describing an introvert. The introvert, on the other hand, is the type of person who may just prefer being with one or two close friends, who isn't crazy about large parties or really huge, loud concerts, and who prefers a more quiet setting with just an intimate group of people. So as you can see, personality types are just a way of describing the pattern of characteristics that make these two types of people different. And what that allows us to do is to categorize different types of people as either extroverts or introverts. What it doesn't let us do is to tell you how extroverted the extroverts are and how introverted the introverts are. It can only tell you if a person is an extrovert or an introvert. They describe qualities that are different for the category of extroverts compared to the category of introverts. These types or categories are also mutually exclusive, which means that you can't be more than one type. And this can present a problem because although we do know people who are clearly extroverts and others that are clearly introverts, there are some people we may know who might fit in either bucket depending on the time. But types are mutually exclusive, so you can't be more than one. And they're discontinuous. They are completely separate and unrelated to each other. You can classify people into the buckets, but once you have somebody typed as an extrovert, they can't be an introvert. You can't be more than one. Here's some examples of some types that we've studied. This was Galen's model for temperament based on the model that was proposed for health by Hippocrates. And Galen thought that your temperament is a direct product of an excess of one of the four bodily fluids. Remember the four bodily fluids? An excess in any one of those will produce a specific personality type. So for the choleric, that is associated with an excess of yellow bile. That's the person who's quick to anger, who tends to be anxious at times. The melancholic is associated with an excess of black bile, and that is the person who tends to experience more sadness or depression, melancholy. The phlegmatic is associated with too much phlegm. This is a person who is calm, doesn't get angered easily, doesn't necessarily feel extreme positive or negative emotions either. And then there's the sanguine, and that's associated with too much blood, and that is the happy-go-lucky, optimistic person. These are probably the earliest typology for personality or temperament that we know of. Here's one that I also mentioned for historical interest, and that is the somatotypes typology that was proposed by Sheldon. Sheldon hypothesized that temperament arises directly from your physical body type. So we have the endomorph, that's the person who tends to have more body fat, less muscle. That describes a person who is slower, who does not get angry or upset or excited easily at all, who tends to be easygoing. Then we have the mesomorph, and that is the person who is predominantly muscular. And that kind of person, according to Sheldon, would be the competitive, easily angered, short-tempered type. And then the ectomorph is the type of body that there is more skin and bones and nervous system tissue than muscle or fat. And that body type, Sheldon associated with higher intelligence, higher anxiety, and being introverted. So Sheldon hypothesized that the physical structure of your body determined your temperament, and thankfully that has been discredited. And probably the most famous typology is one that we've already talked about, and those are the extrovert and introvert types that were originally proposed by Jung. Jung's definition of an extrovert and an introvert are very different than how we talk about those two types today, but we'll study that more when we get to the psychodynamic view of personality. Here's another typology. Funder throws this one in, I think, just for fun. Muhammad Ali thought you can classify everybody into one of these 4 fruits: the pomegranate, the walnut, the prune, or the grape. And the way he did that was to classify each person according to their hardness and their softness on the outside and in the inside. So for the first one, the pomegranate, you have this hard outside shell, which could be consistent with someone who's just kind of tough and maybe mean and not very nice on the outside. And you also have this hardness on the inside. You have these seeds. They have a little bit of a soft covering, but mostly they're just hard seeds. And so a pomegranate is the hard type of person who not only is tough and brusque and maybe not very warm and kind on the outside, they're that way on the inside as well. The next one is the walnut, which obviously is the hard outer covering. This is, again, a person who's kind of tough and mean on the outside. But he also thought that the walnut was soft. So this is the hard, soft person who, even though they have that tough outer external shell, on the inside, they tend to be a little bit more soft and warm and maybe a bit of a pushover. The next one is the prune, and the prune has the soft outside and the hard inside. So even though they may seem like a sweet, kind, nice person on the outside, on the inside they're tough as nails. And then the last one is the grape. And the grape is the soft on the outside and soft on the inside. And this is the kind of person who maybe appears to be warm and kind on the outside, and on the inside they are that way as well. It does make sense in kind of a folksy way, and you can classify probably just about everybody into one of these categories. But even if you can classify just about everybody into one of these 4 types, does that give you enough information to know what that person is really like? Probably not, and that's one of the issues with types. Here are some other types that are included in the textbook. One of them refers to some work done by Caspi, Avshalom Caspi and colleagues. He identified 3 basic types: the well-adjusted person, the maladjusted over-controlling person, and the maladjusted under-controlling person. And their research indicated that these 3 types were replicable in many countries in Europe as well as in North America. So they seem to capture a lot of the personality differences between people. However, they had limited utility because they really weren't able to predict behavior, nor were they able to predict life outcomes any better than traits were. One other typology that you might have heard about is the type A and type B personalities. And this typology was made famous because it was found that type A personalities, those who are competitive and driven and easily angered, those are the type of people that end up getting heart disease more frequently. The type B person, on the other hand, is the more laid back, relaxed, totally non-competitive person. And if you want to have lower rates of heart disease, then type B is the personality type for you. One of the issues with types is that not every individual neatly fits into a type. Even for something that we use frequently like sex or gender, where you're asked to choose either the male or female box. This has changed quite a bit in the last 10 or 15 years, but not everybody fits neatly into either the male or female box. You can see that there's some overlap. Some females tend to be very masculine. Some males have more feminine qualities. Even sex and gender have overlapping distributions. It's not as clear-cut as putting a person into the male or the female type. Here's some other issues with types. One of the things that's a problem is that when you classify an individual into a type, you're not able to investigate further. So let's say you have 3 individuals who have all been classified as extroverts. With the typology, there's no way you could identify which of those extroverts is the most extroverted and which is the least. So you can't compare relative differences between people who are in a same type. One of the major issues is just trying to figure out which typology is the best. As I mentioned with Muhammad Ali's type, we can fit probably just about anybody in one of those 4 types, but is that enough to explain all of the uniqueness of an individual, whether or not they have a hard exterior and a soft interior or vice versa? Does that give us enough information to be able to distinguish one individual from another? Probably not. And with types, you cannot be more than one type. You can't be extroverted sometimes and introverted at other times. You can't have a hard exterior sometimes and a soft exterior at other times. Types are mutually exclusive. They're like buckets. Once you get placed into a type, that's where you need to stay. You can't hop around and be different types. Because of that, because the explanation of your behavior and your personality is limited by the bucket or the type that you get placed in, that results in less of an ability to fully describe who you are as an individual. And because of that, it limits the ability to predict a person's behavior. And in fact, research has shown that typologies don't reliably predict behavior or life outcomes any more than traits do. In fact, much less than traits do. So those are some of the issues with types. So if we're not going to use a typology, then what is the best way to characterize and describe individuals? Research has shown that personality traits, which are continuous dimensions of personality, are the best way to describe a person's individual personality characteristics. Traits are dispositions, like extroversion, that you can measure in each person and get a score, so they're quantitative. And what research has found is that nearly every trait, when measured in the population, has a normal distribution. There are going to be some people that score very highly on the trait. There will be others that score very low on the trait, but most people are going to score about in the middle range for any given trait. Traits have an advantage over types because they can give you a number that describes how much of a trait a particular person has. So they are quantitative as opposed to types, which are qualitative. Traits give you a measure of how much of a personality disposition or trait that person has. And you can measure any trait in any person. So each person can have a score on any given trait. The measurement of traits applies to everyone. Traits also represent a person's average behavior across time and situations. This is an important distinction. Traits are a measure of a person's dispositional characteristics, their tendency to behave in a certain way. They're not an absolute. If you measure somebody's extroversion level and they're in the 99th percentile, which means they're very extroverted, that doesn't mean they're always going to be an extrovert. That just means that on average, they're going to tend to act in a more extroverted way than 99% of everybody else who has taken that test. Here's a diagram of the hypothetical distribution of any trait, but in this case, we're going to use extroversion. On the right side of the distribution, you'll find the scores for people who score very highly in extroversion. We call those extroverts. And on the left side of the distribution, you'll see the few people that score very low in extroversion, and we call them introverts. Most people are somewhere in the middle. This is what we mean by traits are normally distributed. The measure of any given trait will give you this bell curve distribution. A few other important things to know about traits. They are constructs. We can't see a trait. It's not something that you can actually see. What you can see is you can see the behavior, the statements, the facial expressions, all of those things in the personality triad that go along with a trait, but we can't actually see a trait. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because if I were to stand up in front of a classroom and hold up an eraser and let go, that eraser would drop to the floor. Why would it drop to the floor? Because of gravity. Gravity is a construct. Gravity is what pulled that eraser down to hit the floor. We can't see gravity, but we can see the effects of gravity, and the effects in that case were the eraser dropping to the floor. This is very similar to personality traits. We can't actually see personality traits, but we can see the behavior that is the result of personality trait constructs. Because we can't actually visually observe them, we refer to them as being latent in structure. We can only observe the effects. We can only observe the behavior that's a result of personality traits. One of the great things about personality traits is that because they're quantitative, because we can get a number for everybody when we measure any particular trait, it can give us much more precise information than if we were just able to classify a person into a type or a typology. And because we can get more precise information about each person, we're able to better explain their behavior and predict future behavior. When personality researchers consider the structure of personality and how personality traits fit into that structure, we consider them to be something like building blocks or puzzle pieces. And a person's personality is made up of a number of those building blocks or puzzle pieces. So personality as a whole is the result of a combination of a small number of basic traits. Now, research has shown that the number that appears to be the most agreed upon by researchers at this time is that there are 5 basic traits, but we don't know that for sure, and research continues. But we do know that personality is thought to be comprised of building blocks of small numbers of basic traits. The most interesting thing about the study of personality is that everybody has a unique combination of traits that make up their own personality. When we're considering behavior that's associated with a person's personality, one of the things we have to remember, and I've mentioned this before, is that any given behavior we believe to be caused by not just one trait, but more likely more than one trait, because behavior occurs in a continuous flow and it is affected by multiple personality traits, multiple personality characteristics, as well as situational characteristics at any given time. And as I mentioned before, traits are not directly observable. Traits are considered to be latent, they're constructs, but we can observe the behavior that is the result of a person's personality traits. All of this discussion of traits really begs the question of what exactly is a trait? The father of personality psychology, Gordon Allport, wrote extensively on traits, and here's some of the most important things that he wrote. One is that traits are more than nominal. So the trait of extroversion is more than just a description of your behavior. It's an internal dispositional tendency to behave in a social manner or in a non-social manner if you tend to be more introverted. Allport also believed that traits are not stagnant. They are able to respond to different situations. They're dynamic. The expression of a trait can vary depending on the situation. Allport also wrote, traits are also something that you can measure. They're quantitative. We can get a number. We can get a measure for each person. He also believed that traits are only relatively independent of each other. So we've got all of these building blocks of our personality in the form of traits. Some traits are correlated. There are some traits that you will find consistently in the same kind of person. In those that are good leaders, for example, you will find high levels of extroversion, high levels of agreeableness, and high levels of conscientiousness. All of those 3 traits are correlated in a person who's a good leader. Allport also believed that showing behavior that is inconsistent with a person's level of a personality trait doesn't mean that that personality trait measure was wrong. If a person scores highly on a trait of extroversion, for example, just because they behave in an introverted way on 1 or 2 occasions doesn't mean that they're inconsistent. It just means that traits express themselves in different ways at different times. Allport also believed that you can study traits in one individual, you can do a case study, or you can study the structure of personality across many individuals. And studying the structure of personality across many individuals is what formed the basis of the 5-factor model. So thinking about traits and types, which is a better way to capture personality? We can consider both traits and types. Traits are quantitative. They allow you to get a number that tells you how much of a trait a person has. You can also measure more than one trait, multiple traits in each person, and because they're quantitative, they allow you better explanation and description of a person's behavior, and because of that, a better ability to predict their future behavior. Traits give you the added benefit of being able to compare relative differences between people on the same trait. You can't do that with a type. With a type, all you know is that you may have two people that both fit into the same type. There's no way that you can identify who is more of that type than the other. Because traits are quantitative, because they give you better description, explanation, and prediction, they have been shown to be reliable and valid predictors of important life outcomes. Looking at types, types are qualitative. They just describe a category of behavior. And remember, a type is a specific pattern of traits. And that could be advantageous because saying that somebody is a type A, for example, gives you a lot of information in just one statement. It gives you a lot of information about several traits in just that single label. However, if you've got two type A people, you're not going to be able to understand how they might differ and still both be type A's. Because you have that limited information, it also limits your ability to describe and explain an individual's behavior with just a type with any degree of precision. And those in turn limit the ability to be able to accurately predict behavior with just a type. Another issue is that most personality characteristics are not dichotomous. Remember, it turns out that any given personality disposition appears to be normally distributed in the population. So it really doesn't make sense to consider people as very high or very low in any characteristic when most people fall in the middle range. For example, on the Myers-Briggs Types Indicator, it is a questionnaire score that determines whether you are an extrovert or an introvert. If your score is above the mean, that makes you an extrovert. However, if your score is below the mean, that makes you an introvert. Sometimes those people in the middle who are just a point or two away from each other and who appear to be more similar end up being in different typologies just because one had a score that was above the mean and the other had a score that was below the mean. And that probably isn't an accurate reflection of their true differences in extroversion. And last, research has not indicated that typologies are very good at predicting important life outcomes or predicting behavior, as well as traits can. So that sums up the differences between types and traits in conceptualizing personality. In the next section, I will talk about the 3 different approaches to studying traits.